Okay, everyone, hello and welcome to the Cclp 2022 Legislative Preview Agenda event. We've got a great event ahead for you over the next hour and a half. We've got two panels today you'll be hearing from. First one that'll be highlighting our clean slate legislation and criminal justice work with some special guest speakers from the community, from the legislature, and from some of our partner organizations. And then we also have a panel following a very short transitional break that will cover the rest of our very broad and aggressive, powerful legislative agenda again this year. Happy to have you with us today. I'm just going to cover a few logistics for you before we get started with the actual event. First of all, as most of you have seen, we have a chat window going here on Zoom. We just ask that you introduce yourself in the chat so we can see who's here today. And you can all say hello to each other. Appreciate that. I see lots of folks doing that already, so thank you. For those of you who already done so, and go ahead and do that if you haven't yet. Separately from the chat, at the bottom of your screens, you'll see there's an area labeled Q&A. As we go through each of these panel discussions, we'll be taking questions in that Q&A box. So please don't hold your questions till the end. If you don't want to, you can go ahead and type them in the Q&A section whenever they occur to you. Please don't put them in the chat because there'll be some other things going on there. They'll be a little bit hard to find. So just find that separate Q&A box along the bottom of your screen right near the chat, and go ahead and put your questions in there at any time, and we'll just take them at the end of each of the two panels as they come in that order. And hopefully we'll have enough time to get to all of the questions. We will see. So I'll remind you about that again before we start the Q&A, but keep an eye on that Q&A box as questions occur to you. We also have today simultaneous interpretation in Spanish by two wonderful interpreters that are joining us, Teresa and Beatrice. Beatrice is a member of the Cclp Board of Directors, in addition to working at Sintes Language, who she is representing today. So I'm going to introduce Beatrice here for just a moment, and she's going to explain how the interpretation function works. Beatrice, go ahead.
Good morning, or I guess good afternoon, everybody. For those who speak English, you don't really have to do anything because the whole content will be provided in English. You can just listen to the presentation as it goes. And I will now explain. Any questions that are asked in Spanish will be in the chat and will be translated in the chat, so everything will go on in English. Now I'm just going to go into Spanish to explain to everybody how this is going to work. Para los que hablen español y van a utilizar la interpretación simultánea, mi nombre es Beatriz Bonet y soy una de las intérpretes. La presentación va a ser toda en inglés y por lo tanto va a haber interpretación simultánea al español. Para escuchar la traducción a la interpretación al español, cuando se empiece con la funcionalidad de interpretación, van a ver un globo terráqueo abajo a la derecha. Tienen que hacer clic ahí y elegir el idioma español. Si aparece en inglés, bueno, por supuesto eligen Spanish para escuchar la interpretación en español y va a ser todo en español. Si tienen preguntas, por favor pónganlas en el chat y las pueden poner en español. Las intérpretes vamos a estar traduciendo las preguntas al inglés para que las puedan hacer en inglés cuando se llegue a esa sección. Cualquier pregunta, pónganla en el chat, pero si no, ya empezaremos con la interpretación. Y busquen el globo terráqueo a la derecha y hagan clic ahí y elijan el español. Muchas gracias. Bruce, back to you. You can turn on the interpreting, please.
Thank you, Beatrice. And I'm going to start the interpretation now. So everyone should see now at the bottom of your screen also a little globe icon for interpretation. So as Beatrice mentioned, if you're an English speaker primarily, you can just stay on the main channel. You don't need to use that. Everything will be available in English. But if you need a Spanish translation, the ES Espanol or Spanish channel is available on there, and you'll be able to hear Beatrice's interpretation there. So let us know if you have any technical issues with that. Message me in the chat. Otherwise, that is started. All right, without further ado, I'm going to turn us over to our Executive Director, Tiffany Lennon, to kick off the event. Tiffany, go ahead.
Thank you, Bruce, and thank you, Beatrice. Beatrice Bonet is a formidable leader on the Board of Directors for Cclp. We are very lucky to have her, so thank you. As Bruce said, my name is Tiffany Lennon, and I have the privilege of serving as Executive Director of Cclp. On days like this, snowy and cold, I relish the virtual modality. During the last 2 years of the pandemic, I often wished for live events where we can convene in person, but today I'm glad to be in my warm home. Yet there are many Coloradans who do not have the luxury of virtual work flexibility or even a warm home. Like some of you, I have the privilege of enjoying a stable, secure home, nutritious food, adequate income, and good health care. These basic necessities should not be the privilege of a few. They should be the right of all. How is this still the case in 2022? Many Coloradans are fighting to feed their kids, find decent housing and health care while working low-wage jobs, often more than one low-wage job. A couple of years ago, CCLP embarked on a lived experience narrative project where we captured a couple of stories of poverty. You can find those stories on our website, cclponline.org, or under the resources tab. Or you can go to our YouTube channel and select the videos tab. In these videos, you will hear stories from the Front Range to the Western Slope. These strong, powerful women tell their stories of poverty. How working as a preschool teacher did not allow a mother to feed her 2 children without food assistance. Or how children without Social Security numbers could be denied health care, but for CCLP's legal advocacy. An extended hospital stay forced a mother of 3 to rely on public assistance of just $400 a month. Her advocacy at the Capitol helped to get an increase in temporary aid to needy families, TANF, and basic cash assistance. These stories and many others underscore that poverty is multifaceted and affects all aspects of life. Food, healthcare, housing, and income are interrelated and interdependent. It is imperative that we address how poverty structurally creates and perpetuates harm. We must not accept poverty and the harm it causes. During the panel discussions, you will hear from partners, lawmakers, and CCLP experts on the topics of public benefits, including food and income assistance, healthcare, and employment services. Coalitions, bipartisan support, and community partnerships are key to any legislative success, and certainly to CCLP's legislative successes over the years. Of course, no legislative success is possible without the bipartisan support of Colorado lawmakers. It's my pleasure to acknowledge the public officials joining us. Thank you for your service and commitment to making Colorado a state that works for everyone. And a special thank you to all of you for your partnership. Before I turn today's events over to the moderators and panelists, I would like to remind you of the following. We must use the fundamental instrument of democracy, lawmaking, to influence society and social conditions. Finally, we must not allow the myths about poverty dictate those who are worthy among us. We can achieve economic security and racial equity. In doing so, we will dispel the myths about poverty. With that, let's begin the 2022 legislative preview. Please allow me to introduce Ellen Giratana, CCLP's managing attorney, who will kick off our first panel featuring the Clean Slate legislation. We are so honored to have Ellen's expertise on staff. Her background is every bit as impressive as her commitment to ensuring that laws are enforced equitably. Before joining CCLP, Ellen clerked for the Court of Appeals, Colorado Supreme Court, and Federal District Court. She also worked at the Southern Poverty Law Center in Mississippi, fighting for those incarcerated. She's impeccable in her work, an excellent litigator, committed to economic and racial justice, and she is deeply strategic. Ellen is humble. Although she does walk quietly, she carries a very big stick. Her work has not gone unnoticed. Ellen, I turn it over to you.
Oh, well, thank you so much, Tiffany, for that wonderful introduction. And thank you, everyone, for joining us today. We have a really wonderful group of panelists that I'm super excited to hear from. But first, I just wanted to give you some background about why CCLP is supporting Clean Slate legislation and what Clean Slate even means. So part of creating in Colorado where everyone has what they need to succeed is breaking down barriers to employment, housing, and other basic necessities. Anytime there is a criminal conviction, or criminal record involved, collateral consequences follow, meaning that consequences of a criminal conviction do not start with a conviction or end with the completion of a sentence. In fact, criminal records can create a lifetime of economic inequality and instability, suffered most acutely by people of color. Because of this, convictions and imprisonment are drivers of poverty, and formerly incarcerated individuals see a drastic reduction in earnings over their lifetimes. It's actually really a cycle. Growing up in poverty significantly increases the likelihood of incarceration, and incarceration or criminal justice involvement perpetuates poverty. In her book, The New Jim Crow, Michelle Alexander reported that 2/3 of those detained in jails had incomes under $12,000. Once people leave prison, they don't fare any better. Those who are in prison see a subsequent annual earning reduction of an average of 52%. That means they're making $500,000 less over their lifetime than they would otherwise. And then for those with a conviction but no prison time, they're still seeing their earnings reduced by an average of 22%. And even for those who have just a misdemeanor conviction, they see a reduction of 16%. Because people of color are overrepresented in the criminal justice system, economic impacts are concentrated in communities of color. And this chart really demonstrates the lifetime consequences of having a criminal record. You'll see average formerly incarcerated people start at about $7,000 less than their peers annually, and they end their careers decades later, still trailing their peers by about $20,000 annually. And you'll see that they don't really make it above that federal poverty threshold. Record sealing helps to alleviate these consequences by preventing public access to criminal records in which individuals have already served their time, or in which, in some cases, they haven't even been convicted of a crime. So Colorado actually already recognizes the need for record sealing for individuals in order to provide them with a fresh start, but it still has its problems. We have a petition-based process, and after last session, we also have an automated process for arrests and many drug offenses, which is soon to come. But for the petition-based process, individuals can petition the court to have their records sealed if certain requirements are met and a certain time has passed. Petitioning, however, is expensive, and many people are not even aware that their records are eligible for sealing. So for these reasons and other administrative barriers, an estimated only 5% of eligible Coloradans have gotten their records sealed. Even when sealing is granted by the court, some records still slip through the cracks, and the public still has access to them. And finally, complying with the statute becomes a challenge because it can be confusing, inconsistent, and redundant, which makes it difficult for judges and staff to implement, and even makes it difficult for advocates to really take advantage of the law. So the bill in the upcoming session seeks to do a few things in order to make record sealing more accessible and give teeth to the record sealing statutes. First, it seeks to automate the process of sealing records for people who are already eligible for sealing, meaning that the burden will shift to government agencies to be responsible for going through past convictions, and in cases where there are non-convictions as well, and ensuring those that are eligible are sealed. This removes the administrative and financial burdens that stem from the petition-based process. Second, the bill seeks to place more responsibility on third-party vendors that disseminate background checks to ensure that the information that they share is accurate. This will help to decrease the amount of cases that slip through the cracks and become publicly available. Finally, the bill clarifies and harmonizes Colorado's record sealing provisions to create a more streamlined and efficient process. Right now, record sealing provisions are kind of scattered throughout the statute with varying procedures. Placing them all in one place in the statute with a streamlined process will make it easier for judges, staff, advocates, and parties to understand. This is particularly important now after COVID has really tested our economy and continues to do so. As you see in this chart, and as we all know, unemployment really surged in 2020 and 2021, though it has started to decline, at least as you can see here for the white population. Based on data from the state, Black unemployment has continued to rise, while white unemployment has steadily declined. And while the Hispanic population did see some amount of relief, it still has experienced higher unemployment than its white counterparts. And the trend is, you can see at the end there, is moving slightly upward. And besides unemployment, as businesses reopen, they found it really difficult to rehire. So there has been also a huge increase in resignations across the country, with Colorado being towards the top of the list. There are additional issues about that I won't get into here, but creating a larger base of hardworking and dedicated employees to both help strengthen Colorado's economy, and it will allow opportunities for those who have served their time, and it will alleviate the staffing shortage problems that COVID has created. For this reason, many in the business community have expressed support for record sealing as a route to employment. In fact, JP Morgan's CEO has been a very vocal advocate of clean slate laws across the country and has authored a New York Times op-ed in support of the policy. There's also a growing coalition of businesses that support clean slate legislation, both locally and nationally, as a route to employment. There are additional reasons why it makes sense to remove barriers to employment for people with criminal records. And this goes for both employment and housing and all of the other collateral consequences that come with criminal records. The Colorado AG's office actually just released a report not too long ago detailing the importance of employment and housing stability and reducing rates of recidivism, and is supporting re-entry job creation efforts. Increasing the likelihood of employment and stable housing through record sealing is good, not just for the individual, but for their families, the community, and also Colorado at large. Finally, we are not the only state to take on clean slate legislation. There are states like Utah, Pennsylvania, Virginia, Michigan, Connecticut, that have all passed legislation to this effect and have already begun implementing it as well. There are other states that are contemplating legislation, from states like Louisiana and Texas to Oregon and New York. So I'm going to stop talking now and turn it over to some of our honored guests. Senator Dennis Heise was supposed to join us today, but as some of the legislators know on this call, it is a very hectic schedule and he was unable to make it. But he is sponsoring the clean slate legislation this year in an effort to provide thousands of Coloradans with a clean slate. He has dedicated decades to public service, and we really appreciate his support and his sponsoring this bill this year. Hopefully he will be able to hop on a little bit later, but we'll keep our fingers crossed. In the meantime, I would like to introduce another fabulous speaker, Elisabeth Epps. She is an abolitionist and organizer who founded and serves as executive director of the Colorado Freedom Fund, a revolving community bond fund created for people who cannot afford pretrial bail. Even throughout the pandemic, Elisabeth has not skipped a beat and advocating for those in jail and in those in need of funding. Not only is Elisabeth an incredible advocate for her community, but she also knows firsthand what the impact of a criminal record is, how that interferes with employment and housing, and why accessible record sealing is so necessary. So Elisabeth, I'll turn it over to you.
Hi, good afternoon, y'all. After a couple of years living on Zoom, I still never know if folks can hear me and if I'm doing this right. It's a pleasure to be in this virtual space with you, and thank you, Ellen, for the kind introduction. If I can, I'd love to talk about the impact of this bill on my own life, both personally and professionally, and just sort of share from that perspective. Does that sound good, Ellen? So,
absolutely, please do.
So I came to record sealing, and I hope you all won't judge me too harshly when I share this in full transparency. I can't see faces, but I'm going to pretend that you're nodding and telling me that you're not going to judge me. I attended a record sealing event a few months ago, not as an advocate, although I am that too, but as a participant. I went to the clinic hoping that I could get a record sealed. What I didn't know, and why I'm asking you not to judge me, is I, who am fairly involved in this work and am well-resourced and am working around the good folks doing this work, I didn't know that literally every single thing on my criminal record, everything on it was eligible for sealing in Colorado. I didn't know that. I didn't know until I went. And I offer that to say that if even we who are in this work don't know the depth of the work that's sort of being done in our behalf, then that really should, I hope, motivate us to continue to really educate our community, but also to do what to me is the really exciting part about the upcoming legislation, which is to set in place automatic sealing so that folks don't even have to know, right? So that we're doing the work on their behalf so that folks benefit, even if they aren't necessarily aware that it's being done. Ellen talked about, and others have talked about, the impact that criminal records have on our life outcomes, on access to housing, to employment, and other opportunities. And I want to offer a little bit of my perspective about that. When it comes to this idea of innocent until proven guilty, it's been my experience that when it comes to your CBI report, your criminal record, that there isn't a lot of consideration for innocence until proven guilty. So even on the places on my record where it showed that I was found not guilty, even when it shows that a charge was dismissed, even when it shows that an arrest didn't turn into something else, when someone sees it, they still have a reaction to it, and it's harmful. For me, one of the ways that it was harmful is in endangering my own safety. So before I understood that I could get things sealed, there were folks who were harmful to me and my family who used a past arrest to harass me, to dox me, to threaten me, and to create harm. And so there's sort of a very real world attachment to that harm. Being able to seal my record helps me break a cycle, right? I heard you say, Ellen, that I think it was 5% of eligible Coloradans are utilizing the petition-based sealing process. Is that right? And so I'm one of the folks in that number, and I'm glad to be able to do that way. But at the risk of being redundant, it's just that for me to find out that this was an option makes me incredibly proud of the work that's being done. And it reminds me of what I most love about this bill. I mean, obviously we're all sold on the bill, but I really love that it shows the way the bill has been crafted, right? You were very careful to talk about how it changes processes in the current manifestation, not necessarily expanding eligibility, but how it's improving procedures and access. And what I love about that is it really shows us that when we advocate for the most vulnerable amongst us, we all win. So most of my life, I've been in that most vulnerable category. When it comes to something like employment, right, as a former public defender, I can concede that there's not too many public defender's offices that are going to hold it against you if you've had a municipal arrest, right? Maybe that's an exaggeration, but at least in Colorado, if anything, they understand that if you've endured a municipal arrest and been cleared, you understand what your clients are, what the folks you're working with under, what they're going through. But we know that that isn't the case, right? So the very fact that I can talk openly about my experience is because I've chosen work where my employment opportunities weren't necessarily curtailed, but our neighbors don't have that same privilege. So that really matters. I'm excited about the bill. I'm excited about it personally. I'm excited about it as an advocate. And there's one last point I wanted to mention about a way in which it's really important, or a tangible benefit of the ceiling and having it automatic. I think that many people on this call understand that particularly women, not only women, but there are many cases where women are charged with low-level offenses related to choices that we've made to protect ourselves, that may or may not be classified as domestic violence or not, but that the underlying situation relates to our own protection. I'm trying to say that in a politically correct way. And while those charges are frequently not pursued ultimately or dismissed, their presence on a record can give someone considering you for housing a really incorrect perception of you. I'm very lucky for the past decade to have had a landlord, I'm a renter, to have had a landlord who was herself a survivor. So she understood the context in which to read my record. And I'm really struggling to say that gently, but other folks don't have that same luxury. I hope that makes some sense. And I hope it offers a little bit of insight into the sort of ancillary and further deep benefits of doing this work. So thank you, Ellen. I'm glad to be with you all. Like I said, I'm glad as both an advocate, but also a survivor myself and someone who's benefited from having access to having my record sealed.
Thank you so much, Elisabeth. Your story of the clinic and discovering that everything was actually eligible, like, really demonstrates why we need this and also why continued education is really needed as well. Thank you for those comments. Now I'd like to pass the mic over to our partner, Melanie Kesner. Melanie is the Director of Public Policy for Interfaith Alliance, and she has an extensive background in community organizing and community building. I can say firsthand that she is an unapologetically fierce advocate, and we are so, so glad to have her as a partner on this. So Melanie, if you want to go ahead.
Hi all, thank you so much, Ellen, for that very, very generous introduction. I'm thrilled to be here today with you all. And I'm even more thrilled about the work that we're doing around Clean Slate and the coalition, statewide coalition that we're building. And so Ellen asked me to speak a little bit about the stakeholding work that we're doing and the people that we're bringing together. And specifically, I'm really proud and excited of this bill because we're bringing together a lot of groups and people that don't normally come together. And it's all in the common interest of passing this bill. When we talk about building a coalition, the thing that Cclp and Interfaith Alliance of Colorado and Progress Now Colorado, who are all leading the coalition, set out to do was first building the broadest and most diverse group that we could bring to this work. And so when we talk about clean slate work, I think people often think of it as criminal justice work, but it's so much more than that. As Helen and Elisabeth mentioned, having a record impacts your ability to access education, to access affordable and safe housing. And the stories that we've heard in the last year, having a record even impacts your ability to adopt your children that you're raising, your ability to identify people as your family, and impacts people's lives in a lot of ways. So some of the groups that we're bringing together include ACLU Colorado, Alternative Defense Council, the Brain Injury Alliance of Colorado, National Clean Slate Initiative, the Colorado Criminal Defense Bar, Together Colorado, Cross Purpose, and a lot of the reentry community, Second Chance Center, Tribe Recovery Homes, the Rock Center, Stand for Children Colorado, Lifeline Colorado, Expunge Colorado, Jewish Colorado, Healthier Colorado. We are also bringing together partners who we have historically worked on affordable housing with. So partners like the COVID Eviction Defense Project, Enterprise Community Partners, 9 to 5 Colorado. So all of these groups that bring experience in these different areas, ranging from affordable housing to economic justice, to racial justice, to criminal justice, are coming together to work on and shape and guide the direction of this campaign in this bill. the partners who sit on the steering committee, who have voting power, who have decision-making power, are majority directly impacted folks. So we have groups like Colorado Criminal Justice Reform Center, CCJRC, Second Chance Center, the Harm Reduction Action Center, and we have, oh my gosh, I should have had, but so anyway, the majority of our steering committee are impacted folks. And that was a huge part of this work, was making sure that folks with records, formerly incarcerated people, and folks who are directly impacted and have family in the system are guiding and shaping the bill. I think Ellen and Elisabeth did such an amazing job kind of speaking to the impact and the need for this bill. But just to put some broad numbers, under the current bill that we're working on, under the draft that we have, this would enable 2 million Coloradans to be eligible to have their record automatically sealed. We know that 3 out of 10 Coloradans are burdened with a criminal record, and only 5% of those people who are eligible actually end up getting their record sealed. So that's why it's so important that we work to eliminate the second chance gap and work to automate that process and cut down on those barriers that exist that Ellen spoke of, which include the petition process, which include having to file through a court to get your record sealed, and which include barriers like Elisabeth spoke to, which mean knowing that you have a record, knowing what your record looks like, knowing that you have the ability to seal your record. If you have children, getting childcare. If you don't have transportation, if you don't have a car, getting transportation to the court or to meet with a lawyer. So these barriers really complicate the process that prevent Coloradans from accessing safe housing, from accessing good jobs, quality jobs that provide an affordable living, and as well as they prevent people from getting rid of that stigma that we know comes with having a criminal justice record. I believe one of the questions in the Q&A was, does the record sealing include domestic violence incidents? Fox News type media outlets have said this is included. So I can answer this, and if Ellen wants to kind of jump into more detail, the answer is no. All crimes that are currently listed under the Colorado Victims' Rights Act are not going to be, they're not included in this bill. They're not eligible for automated sealing. And in fact, the bill that we're working on today, this bill that we're working on is not expanding or contracting who and what offenses are eligible for sealing. So that's a little bit about this massive coalition, this massive movement that we're building, and we really need your support. We really need your help. I think, we know this bill will have a direct impact on 2 million people. And Ellen and Bruce, is it okay if I drop the Google form link into the chat for everybody?
Yeah, please do.
Okay, I'm gonna play organizer here because I haven't asked for everybody. And I would really, if you are interested in joining our campaign and staying plugged in, if you have a story or you have a family member and you're directly impacted, please fill out this Google form. Please get in touch with the campaign. And also thank you, Elisabeth. I'm going to read that comment that, oh, sorry, that I did it again. Basically,
anyway. That's what I was going to touch on as well.
Thank you.
Thank
yeah,
you,
I'm going to let
Elisabeth.
you jump in on that, Ellen. Thank you.
Just to Elisabeth's point earlier, that if you were charged, but the case was dismissed or you were acquitted, or there was some sort of result besides a conviction, those are still eligible to be sealed, and with this bill would be automatically sealed as well. So yes, Elisabeth, thank you for pointing that out.
Yeah, and arrest records also provide just as much stigma as criminal records do. And even if your arrest record, even if you have been arrested and not convicted and not charged, people are still carrying around those arrest records. And that's what the bill that we worked on last year did. And we're making sure part of the process that our coalition is working on is not only passing our bill that we've written together, guided by directly impacted folks, but it's also implementing the bills that have passed recently, like House Bill 21-1214, and making sure that that bill that passed last year is being implemented, and people have access to getting their records sealed, as is their right in that law that passed last year. So that's another process of passing policy that our coalition is working on, is implementation and follow through and public education. So that being said, we'd really love your support. We'd really love your participation. There's room for everybody in this big coalition family, in this big campaign. And I think that Clean Slate is really an issue that spans across spheres, and it breaks down the silos between criminal justice issues, between housing, between jobs and economic justice, and between health and mental health. And this is the issue, I think, that provides a really great entry point for teaching people the impact of the criminal justice system on people's lives. So again, thank you to CCLP, and really appreciate all of the work that you guys are doing. And Ellen has literally been a superhero with helping us write the bill draft and cranking things out last minute. So we're super proud of this work, and thrilled for all of you to join us and learn more about it.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Melanie. That's great. I just want to get to a couple more questions before we wrap up this panel. Well, we have a minute here. There's a couple of good ones. So I'll try to summarize the next one. This is a little bit long. And Rod, it's from Rod, but forgive me if I skip over any important parts here. But essentially, it's about the clemency and pardon process. So, a little bit different from the Clean Slate legislation that we're looking at here, but you're wondering if any of the panelists want to weigh in on this. He's got some lived experience with this process of pardons and clemency, and it sounds like there's a real lack of justice and due process within that sphere. So I don't know if this is something that's come up anywhere within the consideration of Clean Slate. But definitely an interesting question if one of you wants to weigh in on that.
I'd be happy to, though I don't want to take up all the space. Thank you, Rod, for your question, and I completely agree with you. I fortunately haven't been directly impacted, but I have represented folks who have tried to go through that process, and it's extremely, I'd say, infuriating to go through it and not have any clue what's going on. There isn't much of any update. You really, those who even get it just, randomly get a note in the mail one day sometimes. So I totally understand where you're coming from there. In this particular legislation, it doesn't fit in with that. I completely agree that it's something that we should be looking at, and that the legislature should be looking at. But unfortunately, it doesn't fit in with the Clean Slate process. And I think this Clean Slate will have the ability to impact many, many more individuals than we might be able to do in this process. But I agree with you. I think it's not the best process, and we need some more due process protections. I don't know if Melanie or Elisabeth want to jump in.
Only to say that I agree with you fully.
No, definitely an important thing to keep on our radar screen in this criminal justice sphere. So thank you for that, Rod. Really appreciate it, and definitely follow up with the team to fill them in a little bit more about that. We appreciate that. And then this next one is specifically for Melanie from Laura about the Clean Slate Coalition. She's asking about employers. Are employers in particular of all types being recruited or considered to participate in the work you're doing? There are definitely employers who believe in the process, but she'd just like to hear a little bit more about kind of the employer and workforce aspect of the coalition.
Yeah, absolutely. That's an excellent question. So our coalition is specifically engaging business partners. And when I spoke about kind of the non-traditional, like odd bedfellows that have come together on this bill, that's part of what I was referring to. This bill has been born out of coordination between the advocacy community and the business community. So we're working very closely with a lot of businesses and stakeholding extensively with both small business owners, with corporations. There's, as you pointed out, there's a lot of employers that are on board with this work. And there's been a big movement around what's called fair chance hiring. Fair chance hiring essentially is employers who are open about their willingness to hire people with records. And I think we need both, right? We need fair chance employers, but on the other end of the system, on the other end, that's a Band-Aid fix to the problem. We need the systematic reform and the systematic change that's allowing people to seal their records, which makes them more broadly eligible for jobs that they need to support their families. So some of the companies that we're talking with and that are supportive, we're working with the background check company Checker. We're in conversation with JP Morgan Chase. We're in conversation with Walmart, with Lowe's. We are in conversation with the Colorado Bankers Association. And then we're also working with like Small Business Majority, Good Business Colorado. And that's work that we're doing extensively, is also reaching out to the chambers of commerce and making sure that employers have input and feel supported and are excited about the work that we're doing. So if you are a business owner or you're an employer, you can also fill out that same Google form, and the campaign will be happy to get in touch with you because we love your support.
Thank you, Melanie. That's great. All right, so we're going to wrap up. Don Burns, a good friend of CCLP and founder of our research institute here, just had a note, really more than a question, about our keynote speaker at our annual event from a couple of years ago. He's released his book about criminal justice system and the impact and cost in the lives of people, which he talked a lot about actually in his keynote address at that event in the fall of 2020. So really glad to hear that's out. I didn't know the book was out yet actually either. So that's definitely direct you to that book. That's tremendous resource too, and a former CCLP keynote speaker. So thanks for that, Don. Appreciate you sharing that. With that, we're going to switch over to our second panel. So if you give us just about 60 seconds, we're going to get one panel shuffled off stage and one panel shuffled on stage, and then we'll be ready to go. So not even really a break. We're just going to have a moment of transition here, and then we'll jump right back into it. So give us just a pause to do that, and we'll be right back with you. Okay, everybody, thanks for giving us that moment to transition from one panel to the next. We are excited now to have a panel composed entirely of our magnificent expert staff team here at CCLP that it's dealing directly with our legislative agenda this year. So we're going to spend the rest of our time together today going through the remainder of CCLP's legislative agenda. So we're going to have a lot of information coming at you in the next 30 or 40 minutes. So definitely still make use of that Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. We had some great questions for the first panel. I'm sure there'll be many more. So go ahead and keep putting those in the Q&A box as they occur to you, and we will have a Q&A period at the end. Translation will still be available throughout, so make sure you make use of translation if you need to. And with that, I'm going to turn things over to CCLP's Legislative Director, my friend and colleague, Shar Robert. Shar, go ahead and take it away.
Thank you, Bruce, and thanks to everybody who's joining us today. We're really living in some challenging times, and it can certainly overwhelm us. But we're also living in some unprecedented times when more people and more policymakers are open to rethinking old assumptions and redesigning and reprioritizing policies and programs to better meet people's needs. I am very passionate about the entirety of our legislative agenda that is embraced by us and our community partners. Whether we're in leadership or in support of other organizations, we recognize that there are many interconnected issues that families face. CCLP staff draw on their time and expertise and work with multiple coalitions of community partners to push forward on many fronts. CCLP is ably assisted by our contract lobbyists, Adeline Hodge and Jennifer Miles of Frontline Public Affairs. Families need income, housing, food, and health. In terms of income, some income-related legislation. First of all, you've just heard about the Clean Slate bill that we're running in conjunction with the Interfaith Alliance and that broad coalition that Melanie mentioned. You will later hear about a very substantive temporary assistance to needy families bill that we are running together with the Colorado Children's Campaign and with the support of about 30 other organizations, including the All Families Deserve a Chance Coalition, Clayton Parent Ambassador, and others. Third, you will hear about our Employment Support Services Fund that is being advanced through our Skills to Compete coalition. In terms of housing, our main focus this year will be manufactured housing. We have been working on manufactured housing issues for quite a few years, but we're focusing on the residents of mobile home parks, working with community partners, including the Colorado Poverty Law Project, the Colorado Coalition of Mobile Home Owners, COCOMO, 9 to 5, Together Colorado, and at least 36 organizations and counties to try to protect this private sector affordable housing stock. We will also continue to advocate for sustained funding for the eviction legal defense program. And we do that in conjunction with the Renters' Rights Roundtable and the Colorado Coalition on the Homeless. In terms of food, CCLP will be actively defending the protection of due process in Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program or SNAP appeals. In terms of health, CCLP will advocate to end unfair prosecutions of public benefits recipients. As we stand in the threshold of the 2020 legislative session, another COVID affected session, we expect another intense but productive year. Those of you on this call, if you're not already connected to our efforts, please sign up for our general email where we will have updates on a number of these bills. If you'd like to become more involved in any particular legislative session or any particular legislation, contact me and I'll make sure you get connected to the right coalition. And to close, we invite any of you representing organizations to let us know if your organization officially endorses any of these bills so that we can list it among the others and show the breadth and depth of support for these proposals. And at this point, I'm going to hand it off to Charlie Brennan, our Deputy Director for Research, who will talk about housing.
Thanks, Shar. So I wanted to give a little bit of background and context to not only our mobile home bill, but also how it sort of fits into the larger context and conversation around affordable housing here in Colorado. So despite our recent efforts over the past 5 years or so, in various ways to address the affordable housing challenges that our state faces, we've seen very little movement in terms of the share of households that are cost burdened. So that's the share of households who are spending more than 30% or more, of their monthly income on housing costs. As you can see here on the solid lines, they've remained fairly flat, although the rate for renter households is far greater than that for owner households, shown in the red. To me, this highlights just how challenging of an issue tackling housing affordability is, and it suggests that we need to pursue a multitude of different policies and strategies to both create new affordable housing options in our state, but also preserve existing affordable housing where it is today. When we look at affordability by the type of housing units that Coloradans reside in, we see that the greatest level of affordability is found among Colorado households who live in single-family homes. This is not surprising, especially when we consider the previous slide that show that owner households tend to have the lowest instance of housing cost burden. Many folks who live in single-family homes in our state also own those homes. However, other than residents of single-family homes, we can see on this chart on the slide that residents of mobile homes in our state also tend to have some of the lowest incidence of housing cost burden and severe housing cost burden in our state. What this suggests is that, to me, is that preserving existing mobile homes in mobile home parks and maintaining mobile homes as a viable housing type in our state will be essential to addressing our state's affordable housing crisis. Losing this valuable source of existing affordable housing will make our affordable housing challenges worse. And that said, I don't want to underplay the fact that still over a third of households who live in mobile homes are facing affordability challenges themselves. Although mobile homes make up a small portion of Colorado's overall housing stock, about 4%, as you can see in the chart on the left, nearly 1 in 10 housing units in rural counties in our state is made up by mobile homes. At least it was in 2019. On the map, the counties in the darkest blue are those where between 15 and 22% of the housing stock is made up of mobile homes, a significant share, especially when we can compare it to the lightest blue areas on the map, where it's less than 5%. And those tend to be, as you can see, around the Denver area and along the Front Range. Unlike in urban areas, mobile homes make up an important part of the affordable housing stock in rural areas of our state, and preserving them should and must be considered as an important piece of any affordable housing strategy in rural communities. And with that context, I'm going to pass it back to Shar to provide a little more details about how the mobile home park bill that we'll be working on this year at the legislative session.
So looking at this particular sector of affordable housing, and we're talking about not all people who own a mobile home live in a mobile home park, but many do. We don't have the exact number. And legislation will affect those who live in a mobile home park. And that means they're not living on their own land, but they are renting space in a park that contains a number of different mobile homes. And this particular situation has some built-in problems. First of all, mobile home, people who own mobile homes are dependent. They might own their own home outright or be paying it off, but they have an additional rent for the piece of ground that their mobile home sits on. And their landlord, the mobile home park owner, is able to raise the rent annually as by whatever amount they want. Now, this can happen in apartments as well, but on the other hand, when you're in an apartment, you don't need to literally move your apartment with you if you can't afford the rent. With a mobile home, they aren't actually that mobile. And so the house when the house underneath them, when the lot that they sit on is sold, it can potentially displace them if their rent goes up too much, and they can also be displaced by redevelopment of a mobile home park into a different type of building or a higher density building. And so even if they own their own home, they don't have that security of owning the land under their home. And as I said, mobile home is sort of a misnomer because most can only be moved with great difficulty and expense, somewhere in the neighborhood of $10,000 if they can be moved at all. Older mobile homes pre-1976 often can't be moved at all because of the different standards to which they were built. But then relocating, for those who are currently living in mobile home parks which are closing, their options are limited. There's only a certain number of mobile home parks that will accept a mobile home if they can move it there. And if they move out of a mobile home into an apartment or rent a house, it is almost invariably more expensive, and they risk losing any equity they had in the mobile home if they can't move it. So those are the problems that a number of organizations have been discussing. Next slide. So what would legislation do? So legislation would address that basic insecurity of how much the rent for the piece of ground underneath their home can increase by, so that it is more absorbable year to year. The next one is that if a mobile home park goes up for sale, that residents who live there have a better chance of being able to buy the park and therefore not be displaced. Cclp did legislation a couple of years ago to allow for the opportunity, but of the 48 mobile home parks that have been sold in the last couple of years, only in 2 cases were the residents able to get together and get accepted their offer to be able to buy their own mobile home park. There's a number of reasons related to this, a lot of them due to the timelines being too short, and so those will be addressed. And then the last part of it has to do with the dispute resolution process, which was set up by a previous bill that that Cclp worked on. There have been so many residents trying to use this dispute resolution process that the effort is really understaffed, and there are months-long delays to address those complaints. So those are sort of the 3 basic elements of that legislation. And at this point, I'm going to turn it over to Allison Neswood to talk about the rest of our legislative agenda.
Hi, everyone. Thanks, Shar, and to everybody for being here on the call. My colleagues are so cool, so I'm thinking about that right now a little bit. So you've made it to kind of the last stretch of our presentation today. And during this portion, my colleague Liz and I will be talking about sort of the last set of bills or legislative issues that we'll be working on this session. And sort of all of these issues are going to address sort of different things, different topic areas. But a central aspect to all of them is really about making sure that government programs work, that they work for the people who are facing poverty, and it's about making sure that we really recognize and work to remedy the ways in which government systems that are supposed to help alleviate poverty instead end up making poverty more taxing or more costly for people that are already struggling to get by. So to help sort of set that framing, I'm going to briefly talk about this concept of administrative burden in public programs. You can go to the next slide. So when we think about administrative burden in public programs, we're talking about burdens for users or benefit recipients. It's one way that really sort of clarified this concept for me was thinking about the cost of administrative burdens. And there are 3 different kinds of costs. You might think about learning costs, which is the time and effort and resource it takes to learn complicated program rules, learn who in the household might qualify for what, learn what you have to do in order to get access to those basic services. So there's, time, energy, and resource that has to go into that process. And then there's compliance costs, which is the time and energy it takes and resource it takes to actually do those things to qualify for services, whether that means, getting transportation to an appointment or a caseworker's office, or, actually filing paperwork or filling out forms, reporting changes every month or multiple times a year to your household or your income. Well, again, those things take time, they take effort, and they take resources. And then there's this area of psychological costs, which can be characterized as sort of distress from loss of autonomy. You have to share a lot of really deeply personal details about yourself when you're applying for these programs. You have to report changes in personal circumstances and personal circumstances. And so that loss of autonomy there. There's uncertainty about whether you might qualify for something or whether you might lose access to an important program. And then, as much as we as an organization and many of our partners try to, do good work pushing against this, there's still really strong stigma throughout our culture in this country around use of public benefit programs. And so that's another sort of cost piled on top of people when they're trying to cut through this administrative burden in public programs. Next slide. And there are, these administrative burdens or hurdles are often couched in sort of reasonable sounding justifications or theories. One of them is program integrity, like making sure that the services are only utilized and accessed by the people who are eligible for them. So really making sure that we're monitoring using the funding of the program as intended. The next one is really about, or it could be about sort of encouraging desired behaviorism. So, under the Trump administration, there was this big effort around imposing work requirements, sort of monthly burdensome work reporting requirements in the Medicaid program. These kinds of requirements already exist in other programs. And so the idea there is that we're encouraging work, but what we're really doing is increasing the administrative burden of maintaining coverage under certain programs. And then another theory might be about allocation of scarce resources to the neediest in our population. If people have to answer sort of a lot of questions about their circumstances to meet a range of eligibility requirements, then theoretically we may be targeting sort of the highest need populations in our communities. Next slide. But those theories definitely fail to consider a lot. They fail to consider the costs, like I mentioned before, of these burdens, both for beneficiaries and for the system. It's very costly for the Medicaid system or the food assistance system or the unemployment system to be processing constant paperwork or processing eligibility. Also, the capacity to navigate a lot of these burdens can be tied to privilege, already having a network of people that you can ask for help, already sort of speaking a language that, speaking English, the language that's used in the office or by application assisters. And so we're not actually maybe targeting the neediest folks, we're targeting the people that already have privilege that helps them navigate the system. It also considers that these burdens will end up excluding people who are eligible for programs. We have high rates of sort of eligible but not enrolled people in programs like our food assistance program in Colorado, and these administrative burdens tie into that. There's also political motivations a lot of times behind these administrative hurdles. Wanting to make programs harder to get on is a political objective. Sometimes for our elected leaders. And then there's sort of unconscious or even overt bias sometimes in how these hurdles are applied. So somebody maybe comes in to apply for benefits and they don't speak English, or they look foreign. We have seen people get turned away because somebody assumes that they're not eligible. And these administrative burdens in themselves are burdens or barriers. They're hard to get over and navigate, but are especially so for people that are already dealing with financial barriers, that are already dealing with racism or other forms of bias and discrimination, or who have sort of language access issues or disabilities. And so really important to really think more broadly about what purpose, intended or non-intended, these administrative burdens serve. Next slide. So this will lead into my discussion of the sort of first legislative effort in this portion of our presentation. And so one of the ways that this administrative burden and program complexity creates problems for folks is that it can end up in sort of unfair or inappropriate fraud or civil or criminal fraud investigations. And so if somebody puts incorrect information on an application, either because they made a mistake, or they didn't know, or they're feeling really insecure about sharing certain information about their family, that somebody doesn't have a social security number, or those kinds of things, leave information off an application that can spiral into a fraud investigation that has further consequences for people down the line. And our work on this particular issue is actually grows out of a state Supreme Court decision that was issued last year. In that case, a mother had accessed Medicaid, so Medicaid for her children, and had incorrect information about her income on her application, and was ultimately prosecuted for that under our criminal theft statute, and determined that she had used over $20,000 in benefits and was convicted of a high-level crime, class 4 felony, and ordered to pay tens of thousands of dollars in restitution. And one of the things that the Supreme Court said that was really the state Supreme Court said that was really problematic was that even if the children were eligible for some portion of those benefits, it didn't matter, since they derived from that inaccurate application, all of the benefit, the woman was criminally liable for all of the benefits, even if her kids were eligible for some or all of them. And so the primary effort here is to address that portion, and we'll do that in a few ways as listed on the slide. We want to make sure that there aren't any. We want to basically take these cases first out of the theft statute. Theft is criminal theft is sort of a blunt instrument for dealing with this specific public benefit context. We also want to make sure there's no criminal liability if somebody receives benefits that they qualify for. It's very contrary to sort of the public benefit, the idea of foundation of public benefits, that if you're eligible for them, you're entitled to them. And we want to make sure that the prosecutors for these cases really have to show that the person intended to take something that they're not entitled to. It wasn't, I left this information off my application because my partner doesn't have a social security number, or because I'm dealing with domestic violence and I don't want to have my partner on the application. Those kinds of things that can kind of get people tied up in fraud issues. And then lastly, want to just make sure that the offense penalty or the offense level and penalties make sense, that we're not creating a system where people have to pay back more than what they accessed in public benefits and that sort of thing. I saw that there was a question from Evie Hudak about this particular effort in the chat. Question about who we're working with on this. This is an effort that doesn't have an official coalition right now, though we'd be really happy to have partners reach out. But we are working with sort of attorneys that represent clients in these cases, as well as our partners who really know public benefit systems well, and where people get tied up in issues, and where and also with public benefit recipients themselves, to really understand these burdens and how they can spiral and make additional claims. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to my colleague Liz, and she's going to talk about a couple other public programs and and policy work we're doing around them.
Yeah, thanks, Allison, so much for the overview. I'm going to do a little bit of a review of some of the other public benefits legislation or efforts that we are involved in. First is the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, also known as SNAP. We are heavily involved in some of the efforts right now to reform SNAP hearing process. At the moment, SNAP recipients have a natural right to disagree with any sort of county decisions that's made about their account, and they do have that right to appeal. Currently, those hearings are being held through the Office of Administrative Courts, which hears a variety of different cases, specifically around Medicaid, SNAP, TANF or temporary aid to needy families, workers' comp, etc. For those particular SNAP appeals, federal regulations require that the agency has 60 days from the date of a request of a hearing all the way through to a final decision. And Colorado Department of Human Services is very concerned about being sanctioned for going over that time limit. Their solution at the moment is to bring all of those SNAP hearings in-house. So the cases would be actually heard by administrative law judges that are employed by CDHS. And they have decided that they are not going to make this change through a legislative process, but through a budget request instead. SNAP recipients would still need to go through the Office of Administrative Courts in certain such situations, like if there's a dual enrollee, like somebody has SNAP and TANF, or temporary aid to needy families at the same time, or they have SNAP and Medicaid, they might have to have two different hearings. Anybody who's accused of an intentional program violation would still go through the Office of Administrative Courts, but pure SNAP hearings would be conducted by CDHS underneath this solution. Next slide, please. So we're working with and watching CDHS efforts very closely. We're in regular communication with them, along with several other partners who are working on this. Blueprint and Hunger, Hunger Free Colorado, and some other partners. But we do have concerns. Some of those are listed here. We're obviously concerned about ensuring due process very generally in SNAP hearings. We're also concerned about whether or not this shift will actually result in a more timely and fair process. And we have questions about whether this we could do a more equitable, efficient, and just process through legislation to ensure that we're minimizing the unintended consequences of this shift. Next slide, please. On the income front, CCLP is also working on a legislation that would impact temporary aid to needy families, or TANF as we call it. TANF provides cash assistance and work support for Colorado families that really are living far below the federal poverty level, or FPL. So cash assistance can help pay for basic needs for Colorado families like transportation, diapers, food, sometimes school supplies, and it's incredibly important. So under the current requirements, though, a family of two has to make less than $421 a month to even qualify for the program. In addition, the basic cash allotment is currently sitting at 28% of FPL at a federal poverty level, which is close to about $500 a month for a family of three. We know that that's not sufficient. It hasn't kept up with inflation whatsoever or Colorado's high cost of living. So CCLP, in partnership with a lot of other organizations, are working to improve that program. Next slide, please. This shows a chart from the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities. It illustrates how the current value of the basic cash assistance is not worth the same amount as it was in 1996. And those of you who have been in Colorado for quite some time, we know that cost of living is increased quite a bit So one of the things that we here at CCLP have been incredibly focused on is that the fact that an effective TANF program can really be a targeted way to help lift families out of that extreme poverty. And so we recognize how vitally important it is to improve this program. As I said, that we do have a broad coalition of partners that's working to improve the program. CDHS is at the table along with Colorado Children's Campaigns, who is leading these efforts, Clayton Early Learning Parent Ambassadors Program, Coalition for the Homeless, Consumer Health Initiative, and a lot of other partners, including those with lived experience who have been TANF recipients either currently or in the past, are all coming together to improve this program. The solution is a bill. This proposal will address several important components of the TANF program at once. First, we're seeking to increase the BCA, or basic cash assistance, up to 50% of the federal poverty level. This would happen over a 5-year period and include a cost of living increase. Second, we would want the program to improve the ways in which it serves and partners with families. So for example, we would like to see that every family on the program is assigned and contacted by a caseworker, so they have a direct contact to better understand their entitlements and rights under the program. This bill would also require counties to conduct exit interviews and report to House and Senate committees on the effects of the program. Finally, we're really committed to helping smooth out the effects of the cliff effect, meaning that as families' income increases, they can oftentimes lose benefits and actually bring home less money than when they were receiving benefits in the first place. This is something that has been studied for years, and we are actively working to address that. So the bill would include an earned income disregard for the first year of employment and a gradual step down of disregarded income after that first year. The bill does a lot more to help address administrative burdens. Thank you so much, Tony. So it does a lot more to help address those administrative burdens that Allison was talking about. And we have resources available for people who are interested in learning more about that. Next slide, please. Finally, CCLP is working to update and improve the employment support and job retention services. This was originally passed a couple of years ago. It's a program that provides up to $400 to meet emergency needs of people who are searching for a job or who just started a job within the past 6 months. This is vitally important help that helps with emergency transportation or childcare costs or any other fines, fees, and other costs that come up in the employment search or job retention. This is a little bit different from TANF in that it's specifically for emergency needs, and the money goes directly to vendors or service providers. But the work that we're doing actually addresses, would be pushing for an improvement that would address equity, enhance the outreach to ensure that those who are most in need have access to this program, and then help reduce those administrative burdens. That is a wrap on a lot of the work that we are doing here at CCLP, and I will turn it back to Bruce, I believe, for questions.
Yes, thank you, Liz. So some of the team has been answering the questions as they come in, because we've had a lot, which is fantastic. They've been answering some of them in text. So some of your questions, you may see them in the answered section of the Q&A. I see Shar and Charlie and others have been typing answers to some of those. So check those out, and we can come back to those verbally if we need to. But I'll just take the ones that are still open here. We can do those verbally right away. So there's one here from Jodine. She says the summary about administrative burden is so helpful. Definitely agree there. She's curious about resources that we can point to about understanding administrative burden that folks with disabilities face when navigating systems and supports. Who on the administrative burden side would like to take that one?
Sorry,
Allison?
just having a little trouble with my camera and my mute button.
No
But
problem.
yeah, thank you so much for the feedback. Actually, on the slide, which I think we'll post, is a reference to a really great book about administrative burden, which is where, you know, really helped us sort of put this into context and into this framework and to think about our work in terms of that. So we really do recommend that book, and it talks about sort of a number of contexts, you know, how programs and healthcare programs or public benefit programs impact people with disabilities, but also other systems like, you know, voting and barriers in voting and like other systems like that. So you can really think across the board about, you know, who gets to participate in our community and how do systems impact that. I'll say that for now. I think Bethany was also going to be on for questions, but maybe she's not. And so if she does want to jump in or add to the Q&A, any additional resources on that would be great. Or maybe not, just follow up with us later.
There. I will check and see if we can add Bethany and if she wants to weigh in on that one a little bit more. In the meantime, I'll start another one while I do that. So another question from Don, and it's a very good question. Is there any effort to shift from FPL to something like the Self-Sufficiency Standard, which of course is CCLP's premier research publication that we put out usually about every 3 or 4 years, and really is a much more comprehensive and detailed assessment of the cost of living in counties across the state of Colorado, since FPL is grossly outmoded. So Charlie, maybe you want to take that one, or someone else too can certainly weigh in.
Well, I can start. You know, I think, you know, one of the challenges that we face with using something like the self-sufficiency standard rather than the federal poverty limit, especially in these federal programs, is that, you know, the definitions for who's eligible is determined at the federal level. And so even if, you know, we here in Colorado wanted to use a much more expansive sort of, you know, definition of who is facing economic insecurity than the federal government uses, we'd face some limitations there just because the federal government requirements would apply regardless of what the state wanted. And so I think that would be my initial reaction response. I don't know if others have more to add. It would be nice though, because it is a much, for those who aren't familiar, the self-sufficiency standard is our sort of, you know, alternative to the poverty measure, which includes, you know, the whole suite of expenses that households of different compositions face in all parts of our state, in all 64 of our counties. The federal poverty limit is a much more basic and limited sort of standard, and it applies equally across the entire contiguous United States, and so it doesn't really account for differences in the cost of living from place to place. And so it would be nice in an ideal world to be using a measure like the self-sufficiency standard, but unfortunately we're sort of tied to, our hands are tied to a certain degree because of those federal regulations.
Shar, are you going to chime in on that one as well?
Well, I'll just mention that, for example, on the TANF bill, it talks about increasing the TANF grant over time to 50% of federal poverty level. And we chose federal poverty level because that's sort of a benchmark that other states are going for. And when you compare like poverty level to self-sufficiency standard, number one, as Charlie mentioned, it does vary across Colorado, where someone to really meet their basic needs without government or private support might, if they have a family, they might need to be earning maybe 300% of federal poverty level or more. And we're talking about a TANF program where people are earning 28% of the federal poverty level. So the kind of measuring stick is at a, they are so far, the TANF grant is so far from even hitting the 50% mark is called extreme poverty. And we're only barely halfway to extreme poverty. So just for consistency across the different benchmarks and across Colorado, we picked a goal of lifting people out of extreme poverty, but there's still a long way from self-sufficiency.
Thank you for that, Shar. All right, so I'm going to, does anybody who typed an answer want to just cover their answer really quick since we have a couple of minutes? Shar, it looked like you typed a couple of great answers in there. If you want to just summarize those.
Well, I
for
do
folks
want
who
to
haven't had a chance to read
mention,
them.
yeah, since we didn't spend a lot of time on the manufactured housing bill, I think there was a question brought up by, I believe his name was Rod, about, well, aren't they kind of fire hazards, et cetera. And to some degree that was true, especially with the earlier standards, the pre-19, I think 76 was the turning point where they increased that. But there's kind of a bigger problem of stigmatization of people who live in mobile home parks that has been generalized, so that historically a whole lot of cities and counties basically tried to exclude mobile homes from kind of the same way that people fight affordable housing projects as undesirable uses. And even through zoning, you'll notice most mobile home parks are behind kind of closed doors, behind gates, behind, you know, set off from the highway so that nobody has to look at them. They're very heavily stigmatized. And that is part of what we're fighting. There is a true issue in there in that some of the older mobile homes are in disrepair. So I think there's sort of two aspects to that. Number one, mobile homes or manufactured housing, as it's called after 1976, are much better built than the earlier versions, but there still is a very heavy stigma. And I think it's sort of indicative of a general issue related to housing and how people want, they always want houses next to them that are more expensive than the house they're living in. You know, people tend not to be welcoming of low income housing. But there, we have had a lot of discussion around that issue, both the need to upgrade parks, but not to displace people, not to have such requirements on the parks to upgrade that they basically just close down. There's a whole lot of investors and hedge funds that have been buying up Colorado and US mobile home parks so that they can kind of exploit the value of them and resell them for redevelopment. And in a way, they're aided and abetted by some local governments who would rather see a different kind of use that brings in more tax revenue. So that there are a lot of complicating issues, particularly around the stigma of mobile home.
And I just wanted to quickly clarify, in the statistics that I presented, the Census Bureau uses the term mobile home as sort of a general catch-all for all types, you know, mobile homes, manufactured home, modular home, what have you. And so I think there's some, you know, some challenges there in terms of, you know, you're right that there is a distinction between those when you look into, you know, state and federal health and safety regulations, but in terms of the way the census views it, they sort of group them all together. And so the statistics that I presented are sort of, you know, inclusive of all those different types of mobile homes or manufactured homes.
I would mention in part of the reason that's an issue is because disproportionately, the people who live in mobile home parks are people with disabilities. Oddly enough, that seems counterintuitive, but people with disabilities are more likely to live in mobile home parks, as are seniors, as are Hispanic or Latino populations. And then that all gets wrapped into the stigma as well. But they're a very important source of very affordable housing compared to many other forms of housing.
That's great. Thank you. I just want to point your attention. We had a couple of our colleagues add a little bit of additional answer in the Q&A section here. So Bethany Prey, who's our legal director, she weighed in under Colorado Center on Law and Policy about administrative burden. So Jodine, that goes to your earlier question. So make sure you check out her answer, and she's also got her contact information in there, so you can follow up with her for a little more detail if you would like.
Yeah, and
Yes.
Laura Ware with our team also weighed in a little bit on that as well, with work occurring through the Division of Vocational Rehab, just under the Department of Labor and Employment. And then some work that each state agency has to do around creating more digital inclusion for people with disabilities at the different administrative levels. So there is sort of work and investigation and study going on with community partners around that, making systems work better for important folks in our community.
Yeah, thank you, Laura, and thank you, Bethany, for weighing in on that one with a little more detail. So thank you all. I think we covered all the questions, a lot of tremendous detail there. Always more to cover, of course, so definitely stay in touch, get in touch with our team. As you can see, we've got a tremendous legislative team working on all these different issues, so they'd be happy to answer your questions after the fact. We're here all the time, so definitely reach out and get in touch with us here at CCLP. We'd love to hear from you. So with that, we're going to wrap up the content portion, and I'm going to turn it back over to Tiffany Lennon for a few closing remarks to take us out for today. Tiffany?
Thank you, Bruce, and thank you to the entire team. I have to say, I think I'm the luckiest executive director in town by far with this team. I will be brief. I know we are at time here. It's 1:33, and I will be very quick. As you can see, we have many upcoming pieces of legislation that we talked about here, in addition to others, that will really make Colorado a better place, and we will be stronger as a result. If there's a piece of legislation that you're particularly interested in, I invite you to let us know. Be sure that you're signed up for our newsletters and legislative action alerts. I promise we will not clutter your inbox or mailbox. We will, however, keep you abreast of what's happening this legislative session. So I ask you to join us in the anti-poverty movement. You can do so by donating to CCLP. Consider supporting one of the bills you heard about today, the TANF program improvements, Medicaid expansion, manufactured housing, changes to SNAP hearings, or the renewal and expansion of the employment services bill. No matter the amount of your contribution, it truly does make a difference. To support our legislative bills, go to cclponline.org. Finally, please tell a friend or family member about the important work of CCLP. I ask that you make it your goal to educate just one person this week about our work and how vital it is to the anti-poverty movement. Let them know what we stand for, and I really do mean we. Thank you for your time and attention, and we will see you at the Capitol.